And today, for the next 20, 25 minutes, we're going to talk about something that will make some of you feel uncomfortable. We're going to talk about money. Yay! Right? And we are in this series in Luke, and one of the beautiful things that when you take a book of the Bible and you just teach through it is that you get what you get. And so this passage that we're going to look at today, Jesus spends quite a bit of time talking to us about money. And they reference the passage in that video that we just watched a number of times. And one of the things that comes out of this is the realization that we live in a culture, or we are swimming in the cultural waters of a little bit more. Just a little bit more. It's a worldview that communicates to us that we need just a little bit more. A little bit more time. A little bit more money, a little bit more house, a few more toys, more RAM, more hard disk space, more things that give us pleasure. And I live with the temptation, and most of the people that I know live with the temptation of the voice that tells us life will be happier if we have just a little bit more. And the passage that we're going to read here this morning, I think shows us God's love for us when Jesus talks about the danger of living with that kind of a worldview. And yet it's the waters in which we swim. So I want to read for you from Luke chapter 12, beginning at verse 13. And just to remind you, Jesus has been having a tete-a-tete with the religious leaders at a meal, and then a crowd is growing and growing to the point that people are fumbling over each other. And Jesus is talking to the crowd and to his disciples who are there. We looked at that last week and what that might have looked like. And then that brings us with this huge crowd scene to verse 13 in Luke 12. And I want to read for you. Then someone from the crowd called out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide my father's estate with me." It's a reasonable request. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such things as that?" And then he said this, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed, because life is not measured by how much you own." So he told him a story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. And he said to himself, "Well, what should I do? I don't have room for all of my crops." And he said, "I know. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. Then I'll have lots of room to store all my wheat and other goods. And I'll sit back and I'll say to myself, 'My friend, you have enough stored away for years to come, so take it easy. Eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, you will die this very night, and then who will get everything you worked for? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship toward God.'" He's speaking to the crowd. Now he turns back to the disciples in verse 22. And he says this to them, "That is why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food to eat or enough clothes to wear. For life is more than food, and your body is more than clothing. Look at the ravens. They don't plant or harvest or store food in barns, but God feeds them. And you are far more valuable to God than any birds. Can all your worries add a single moment to your life? And if worry can't accomplish a little thing like that, what's the use of worrying over bigger things? Look at the lilies and how they grow. They don't work or make their clothing. And yet Solomon, King Solomon, in all of his glory, was not dressed as beautifully as they are. And if God cares so wonderfully for flowers that are here today, thrown in the fire tomorrow, he will certainly care for you. So why do you have such little faith? And don't be concerned about what to eat, what to drink. Don't worry about such things. These things dominate the thoughts of unbelievers all over the world. But your Father already knows your needs. So seek the kingdom of God above all else, and he will give you everything you need. So don't be afraid, little flock, for it gives your Father great happiness to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. This will store up treasure for you in heaven. And the purses of heaven never get old or develop holes. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it. Nothing can destroy it. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. I love when Jesus just speaks straight into something that relates to everybody. Because I'm looking at the camera and imagining those of you watching online, I'm looking in this room, and one thing I know is that all of you need money. It's something that just is a part of the fabric of everyday life. So it kind of makes sense to talk about money. And what Jesus does is shows us a love of God for us, because he shows us that while money or wealth is important, there are things that we need to be careful of. And there's two examples early on in this passage about the enemy within. You know that expression, the enemy within? We've seen the enemy and he is us, that kind of thing. And if you're following along, there's this huge crowd that is gathered because people love seeing conflict. And there's conflict happening with Jesus and the people around him, and the crowd keeps growing. And someone in the crowd yells out, "Jesus, I've got a family member and we've got the estate and they're not giving it to me." It's probably an older brother and a younger brother, and the younger brother is saying he needs to give me part of the estate. And the enemy within is something that's incredibly dangerous for all religions, particularly for people in the church. And the response Jesus gives, I love. Where he just says, like, dude, don't bother me with that stuff. There's more important things. There's an author who talks about this idea of Christo-paganism. And this is this first enemy within. This guy wants to use Jesus to get what he wants. Now, religiously, if we could just stop for a moment and think, like, in the culture of the day, the religions around the Jewish people, Jesus and the earliest people in this story, these are all Jewish people that we're reading about. And all the cultures around had creation stories where the gods created humanity to serve them. So we exist because God's up there created us to serve them. But the Jewish biblical story about God and creation was not that God created humanity to serve them, but that God created humanity out of love and to be in relationship with him. And so for most religions, the way that you get ahead in life is you do things to get the gods to do what you want. And this is a classic example of someone living that worldview. Jesus, I want this, you help me get it. And it's like there's this bargaining with God, and Jesus will have none of that. And it leaves us asking the question, how often do we behave and live in a way that we think if we just do this, then we can get God to do that? And there's this wonderful warning that Jesus is displaying for us with this idea of Christo-paganism. You see it really explicitly in prosperity gospel, like name it and claim it. You know, if all of you give me $50 today, God will bless you sometime down the road. So I'll just leave a plate here at the front. And those of you who want to take me up on that, we'll just see how that works, right? No, of course not. But there's another enemy, not just trying to live in a way that we think we can manipulate God to get what we want and justify our behavior, but Jesus gets really explicit. In verse 15, he says this, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured." I made these, and obviously I didn't get those edited very well. Life is not measured by much you own, by how much you own. And there's going to be another typo in there that I caught earlier this morning, and these can't be corrected on the computer because they're JPEGs. And for those of you that are I've just ruined the whole morning for you, I apologize. And get over it. There's this warning against greed. any kind of greed. Be careful with greed. Greed is everywhere. Greed is that worldview that says, I need just a little bit more. One very wealthy man years ago, long time ago, was asked, how much more money do you need? And he said, I just need $1 more. And I think he made the point that is true for all of us. It's so hard to push back against that because we're swimming in that water. And when we swim in that water, it just gets easy to justify everything that we do. There's a guy named Walter Brueggemann. And when you see a picture of him, he just looks like this irascible, old, crusty white dude. And he's an Old Testament scholar, and he's wonderful. And I love reading his stuff, and I love listening to him. And he recently wrote a book called Materiality as Resistance. And one of the things he kind of puts forth in the book and in some of the talks around this concept is the best way to combat greed and materialism is regular, rhythmic, radical generosity. And one of the things that I've noticed in our culture that's become really popular is GoFundMe, right? How many of you have participated in a GoFundMe? Yeah, I have too. They're great. Someone's in need and we can help instantly because we wouldn't have known about the need otherwise. It's great. One of the dangers of it is it creates a culture that I'll give when I want to what I want, and often it doesn't end up leading to generosity. It is a little bit here and a little bit there. And I think I agree with Walter Brueggemann that the best way to combat materialism and greed in our life is the regular, rhythmic, radical nature of generosity. When we are just, it becomes habit to be generous. And Jesus tells a story right after he says, hey, watch out about greed. And he tells this story of a rich man who gets richer and richer. And the story, I mean, we just read it. Well, here's a great idea. I'll tear down my old barns because they don't hold enough, and I'll build bigger barns. Then I will be happy. And I think we have to be careful not to dismiss that story too quickly. And I love this story because I read this story and it just ends up being a mirror. And I'm like, oh, yeah, what's the next story in the chapter here? Let's just gloss over that. And I love these passages that do that to me because the temptation is I just want to dismiss it. It's too hard. And I think, this is when the Holy Spirit says, no, Paul, let's camp out in this a little bit. And then you're forced to ask questions. But I think we need to be careful when we read this story that we don't just gloss over it. Well, that's not me. That's Jeff Bezos and other people like him. Look at verse 21. A person is a fool. That's strong language that Jesus uses. A person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. And you notice it's not an either or. It's just, yes, there are things we have to plan for in the future, but we need to be careful that the first doesn't overtake the second. And of course, what does it mean to have a rich relationship toward God? He's going to spell this out for us in a moment. So he's talking to the crowd at this point. And I love this because sometimes I get people saying, oh, the church talks too much about money. I'm like, we hardly ever talk about it. In fact, I think we should talk about it more. If this is your first Sunday here and you hear me talking about money and you're rolling your eyes, I have a job for you. I want you to go back and watch the last 104 sermons that are online by next week and see if you can find us talking about money like that. Today we're in the text and we're talking about it, and I think it's great. So he's talking to the crowd. Jesus is telling the story to the crowd, which is everybody. And then he turns to his disciples, his followers, the ones who are saying, hey, I'm with you on this. We're following you, Jesus. We're giving our lives to you. And then he says this to them, don't worry about the things that you need, because God cares about you, and he'll take care of you. He'll provide for you. And then sell what you have and give to those who are in need. The rest of what we read this morning is those three things. Don't worry about what you need. God cares about you and he'll provide for you. So sell what you have and give to people in need. So let's just walk through a little bit how that is playing it out. And I think this idea, when Jesus is saying, don't worry about what you need, he is not saying food, shelter, clothing, oh, that's not important. And so don't be tempted to think that it's not important. He's not saying they're not important. He is saying, don't worry about them. Those are two very different things. And I think if you're tempted to feel like, well, food, shelter, it's not important, that's because we come from a place of privilege. We have food, shelter, and clothing for the most part. Talk to somebody who's experiencing homelessness and ask them how important food, shelter, and clothing is. And you'll probably get a different response than what you might be thinking about it. So I don't think Jesus is dismissing the importance of these things. He's just simply saying, be okay. Relax. And why do we relax? Because God knows what you need. And he gives two examples, ravens and lilies of the field. Pick your favorite flower. If you don't know what a lily is, then pick whatever your favorite flower is. But he's saying, here's two examples. Ravens, these are actually unclean animals. So the Jewish people would have seen them as carrion or birds, like scavenger birds. So they were unclean. So they would make you unclean. And he's saying, listen, even these unclean animals that you think are so disgusting, God feeds them. And if God cares about them, how much more will he care about you? An argument from the lesser to the greater. And then he says, look at the lilies. King Solomon, who you know, the wisest, richest king ever, couldn't dress himself as fancy as the lilies. And if God cares about the lilies, how much more does he care about you? If God provides for these things, how much more is he going to provide for you? Verse 28, Jesus says these things. And then he says this. He asks a question. And I think it's such a critical question for us. Remember, he's talking to his disciples, and he says, why do you have so little faith? What an amazing question. And the essence, I think, is if you believe that God cares about you, and God cares about others, and God is not a God that's affected by scarcity. God is a God of generosity. If you believe these things, how willing are you to follow through on it? Why do you hold back? As you read through the Hebrew Bible, or what's called the Old Testament, the biblical writers, as they're writing, all these different biblical writers writing through the Old Testament, again and again give us the idea that God sides with the poor and the marginalized, and that God's way, or the kingdom way, is very different than often what we experience in this world. So for example, Sabbath. You all know I'm taking a sabbatical. It's a derivative of the word Sabbath. It means rest. Every 7 days, don't work. Don't earn money. Don't earn wealth. Don't worry about what you're going to eat. And this is to people who are living hand to mouth often in subsistence culture, where every day you have to worry about what you're going to eat. And yet for the Jewish people, it was take a day off. That's radical. And it's a guard against the worldview of a little bit more. Yes, canceling debt. So there's regular instructions throughout the Hebrew Bible about canceling debt to those who owe you, about releasing slaves. Different culture, different time, but even in that culture it was, these are not your indefinite people. There's a thing called the year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee was every 50 years. Land is returned to its original owners. All debts are canceled, and anybody in slavery is released. And there's evidence that up until the time of Jesus, it actually wasn't practiced. Because I think people have this difficulty with trusting that the kingdom way is possible, is achievable or doable. Don't worry about what you need. They're important, yes, but you don't need to worry about it because God cares about you and He will give you what you need. It's great, right? We need to hear this. And then I so love what Jesus does next. Because He says, this is how God is going to take care of what you need. You ready for this? It's so profound. Verse 33. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. I love it. I love it. Those of you who can, give up what you have so that you can help those in need. This is how God is going to take care of you. At this point, some of you are probably thinking, I didn't know he was a communist. And this is where it gets fun. This is where you can't run from politics. This is where sometimes people will say capitalism is the biblical way. And as I got to tell you, as I read through the scriptures, I'm probably more socialist than I am capitalist. Would you like me to just leave now? I actually think Jesus, sets up a model for us that it goes way beyond socialism and communism because it's rooted in Him and in His way, His model. And this is difficult because effectively what He is saying is those of you who have need to be responsible for those who don't. And the biggest argument against that is, well, it's abused. And when you work with people living in poverty, you'll find out how overused that argument is and how difficult it is to get out of the systems that keep people in poverty. And it doesn't seem fair. And yes, in Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul helps people wrestle with this and says, listen, it's not like you're just going to sit on your duff and everyone who's been working so hard are going to give you things. No, we all participate together. So this isn't promoting laziness, but it does recognize that God has been amazingly generous with us, even though we didn't deserve it. And I wonder if that's a model for God's economy, that we give to people even though we may not know if they deserve it or not. And you got to ask the question, is Jesus just being way too idealistic? Is this like utopian dreaming that actually doesn't work in reality? And you might be thinking that, like, this is nuts, Paul. And I'm like, well, I think I'm pretty accurately conveying what Jesus is asking us to do. And I'm wrestling with this myself as we head towards Christmas and I get asked, what do you want? People ask me that. I pull out my wallet and I pull out a big long list. And then they ask my wife, Claire, and she's like, yeah. Because we swim in the waters of a little bit more. John Wesley was a guy, pastor in the 1700s. And he's credited with a saying that I'm paraphrasing, but it kind of goes something like this: earn all that you can, so that you can save all that you can, so that you can give all that you can. And he lived by a model where he said, this is my standard of living, and I'm going to maintain this standard of living no matter whether or not my wealth increases. And so for him, he decided, here's the standard of living. He couldn't go on a set amount because inflation happens, but he talked about a standard of living, and then he continually gave away what was the excess. Because I think he read stuff like this and he went, Jesus asked, why do you have so little faith? Are we willing to trust God that it's possible in the church to create almost like an alternate economic system where people who are part of this faith community don't have to worry about what to eat, where they're going to live, because they know they're going to be cared for. They're not going to be lazy. They're going to all contribute together. And in some respects, it doesn't seem fair because there are some that have more and there are others who don't. And I think this is where it's helpful to understand the concept of equal sacrifice, not equal giving. The woman with the 2 little coins that Jesus watches put them into the offering. She gave out of everything she had. That's all she had left. That is a huge sacrifice. And Jesus says these other people are putting in huge amounts, but it hardly affects their lifestyle. And I think maybe that helps because even those who don't have can still grow from the idea of equal sacrifice, not equal giving. We started off by talking about this concept of a little bit more, living in the waters that tell us life will be better, life will be happier, life will be more meaningful if we give or if we have just a little bit more. And I suspect you're sitting here asking the question, Paul, how many times can we be asked to give just a little bit more? And we'll just turn the question back. We swim in waters that tell us we need a little bit more, but then you can also fairly ask the question, how many times can I be asked to give just a little bit more? And one of the things that I don't like us to do here is what we call fog. I don't like using fog at New Life, where we use fear, obligation, or guilt to motivate people. So the intention of this is not to be foggy with you, but to just wrestle with the text and to wrestle with you, how serious are we to take the teachings of Jesus and try to model them as a community, not just as individuals, but as a community. And when you're asking the question, how many more times can I be asked to give just a little bit more? I would say that's not for me to answer. That's something between you and God. But I would encourage you not to make the decision alone, but to invite other people into that conversation with you, whom you love and trust, and who won't tell you what you want to hear. Your commitment to Christ and to the kingdom way is revealed by the level of your generosity. Your commitment to Christ and his way is revealed by the level of your generosity. Maybe we could say it a different way. In God's kingdom, you're valued for your generosity, not for your net worth. And that is very different than the world in which we live, in the waters in which we swim. And I put a question here that I'd love to ask you. Am I right with that statement? In God's kingdom, you're valued by your generosity, not your net worth. Am I right? Or is there another way to understand that? And I'd love you to wrestle with that question. Maybe I'm being overly simplistic here, and I need to get my MBA so I could understand global economics more. I'm not sure Jesus cares about global economics if it doesn't alleviate suffering and injustice and poverty. And I think he's asking us as a community, why do we have so little faith? How willing are we to be serious with him about this? Let's pray. I don't want to be a fool, God. And I know the temptation to have just a little bit more. And I know that you're a God of excess, and you're the God of the banquet, and you're the God of the party. So please help me not become a miser or a Scrooge that only wants to save, but that I could let my affluence or blessing that you've given me just affect lots of other people, that I can invite other people into the party. I pray as a community, we could have fun wrestling with this together and not glossing over this story. We don't want to be foolish in your eyes. May we become fools in a culture that says you need just a little bit more. Thank you for Luke capturing this story and sharing it with us. Thank you for Jesus and his early followers who modeled this so well. In the book of Acts, we see it in how they lived. And thank you that over the centuries, your people have heard this kind of call and stepped up and said, we will tackle this. And may we hear your words calling us to beware, to watch out for every kind of greed, because life is not about how much we own, but about how willing we are to be generous and showing the world the God who is generous. Amen. Amen. Well, next week, we're going to finish off this series, Not What You Think, and we're going to talk about this idea about it's not about some kind of heaven later, but experiencing eternity now. And we'll finish, and then it'll be Advent. So, we're going to go out. We're going to have a snowball fight now, and we're going to just enjoy the afternoon. But go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we will see you next week.